Welcome back to our podcast series on the history of rock music. In part 3 of our series, we'll be discussing the evolution of rock music in the 1960s. This was a decade of tremendous change and experimentation in the world of music, and rock played a central role in this cultural shift. We'll explore the rise of the British invasion, the emergence of psychedelia, and the influence of folk music on rock. Let's start by talking about the British invasion. In the early 1960s, a wave of British bands began to dominate the American charts. Groups like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and The Who brought a fresh sound to the world of rock music, combining elements of rock and roll, raw brain and folk music. The Beatles, in particular, were a sensation, and their influence can still be felt in the music world today. Their innovative songwriting, harmonies, and instrumentation set the standard for rock music in the 1960s and beyond. Another important development in the 1960s was the emergence of psychedelia. This was a movement that combined rock music with hallucinogenic drugs and a countercultural ethos. Bands like the Grateful Dead, The Doors, and Jefferson Airplane experimented with new sounds and textures, incorporating elements of Indian music, jazz, and classical music into their music. They also explored themes of spirituality, politics, and social justice, reflecting the tumultuous times in which they lived. The influence of folk music on rock was also significant in the 1960s. Folk music had been around for centuries, but it experienced a revival in the 1960s, thanks in part to the popularity of artists like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez. These musicians brought a new level of sophistication to folk music, and their influence can be heard in the work of many rock artists of the era. Dylan, in particular, was a trailblazer, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in popular music with his poetic lyrics and unconventional song structures. One of the most important trends in rock music in the 1960s was the idea of the album as an artistic statement. Prior to this decade, most rock albums were simply collections of singles and B-sides, but in the 1960s, artists began to think of the album as a cohesive work of art, with each song contributing to a larger theme or narrative. This trend was exemplified by albums like the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is often cited as one of the greatest albums of all time. Finally, it's worth noting the impact of technology on rock music in the 1960s. Advances in recording technology allowed artists to experiment with new sounds and techniques, and this helped to drive the evolution of the genre. The use of new instruments like the Moog synthesizer and the mellotron also helped to expand the sonic palette of rock music. In conclusion, part 3 of our series has explored the evolution of rock music in the 1960s. We've discussed the rise of the British invasion, the emergence of psychedelia, and the influence of folk music on rock. We've also touched on the importance of the album as an artistic statement and the impact of technology on the genre. In the next part of our series, we'll be exploring the rise of heavy metal and hard rock in the 1970s.